Hello and welcome to the BYU Library Family History webinar. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Olivia Tuller and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You are welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is on June 8th with Byron Holdman. He will be giving a presentation entitled The Library of Congress, A Treasure of Genealogy. We had to postpone this webinar from a couple months back when we had technical difficulties, but we're really happy that he was able to reschedule with us for June. So we hope you can make it to that one. If you would like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from James Tanner, who will be giving a presentation on finding success with a genealogical research strategy. Before we begin, here is a little bit about James. James has over 40 years experience in genealogical research and is an avid blogger of Genealogy Star blog. He has served as a family history volunteer for 18 years and has presented at expos and conferences around the US, Canada, and Europe. He is a member of the board of directors of the Family History Guide Association and is currently serving at the BYU Family History Library. James is a professional photographer and has 7 children, 34 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. And we will now turn the time over to James if he's ready.
Okay, so today we'll be talking about finding success with genealogical research strategy. And this is a kind of a learning study and kinds of ways that we approach genealogy and how it makes it so that we can actually have success in finding or whatever we're trying to do with finding our ancestors. So we're going to jump right into it. Today, I guess I start out with the obvious question, and that is, what is a goal? Well, we are kind of a goal-oriented people. We always seem to have something we want to do or want to accomplish, and people run marathons and they study hard, they try to make a lot of money, they open businesses, they do all sorts of things, and those are kind of goals. Well, what we have is kind of a peculiar thing, is what's a genealogical goal? What are we trying to accomplish here, and what's reasonable and what isn't reasonable about of goals for genealogy? Now, if you're going to start your genealogical goal with a goal like, I want to trace my genealogy back to Adam, then perhaps you should take a little bit of time to study about what you're doing and what's going on with genealogy to understand that is not a very reasonable or even a logical goal. But if your goal is to learn about and expand your understanding and what you know about your ancestors and how that can affect you and how it might affect your family, those are kinds of things that we need to kind of make that part of our idea of what we're trying to accomplish in genealogy. So you design your own goals. It's a very personal thing. It's what you decide you need to do to accomplish what you expect to accomplish from doing genealogical research and finding out about your family. And you're also your own measure of success. We don't have any other way of measuring success. Perhaps you have a goal to become a professional genealogist, or perhaps you have a goal to work in a library, in a genealogical library, or you want to do something else that has to do with genealogy, and those are all very good goals, but they're all very personal. And when you achieve the goal, unlike many things, you're not necessarily going to have any way of anyone else recognizing that you've done your goal. So it's got to be internal and self-motivated. So some examples: your goal may be to find your birth parents, and that would be a very good start of goal for genealogy, and to find a remote ancestor. In other words, you may be interested in a family tradition that you were descendant of a famous person. and you want to know if that's correct or true, or you simply want to be able to find one more relative in the process of finding additional people to go to be in your family tree. So perhaps it's better to think of genealogical research in terms of a series of goals. It's like a trip exploring the countryside, going off to look for undiscovered country in a sense, because as you do genealogy, you're almost, it's part of the process that you learn and you develop and you get a greater view of what happens in your greater family and this vast number of people that you turn out to be related to. And everybody, I always have people say to me, well, my family, there's two ways of looking at it, and they're fairly common. One is, oh, my genealogy is all done. Well, that's not physically or even historically possible. So it's not something anybody could claim. On the other hand, there's people that say, well, it's just, I don't have any relatives. I don't know anybody. I don't have any relatives. Well, that's also impossible because of the very direct progression of the number of ancestors that you have is always a function of two, the power of two. So you've got 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, and so forth. And that just after a few generations, you can see that you're related to thousands and thousands of people, especially if you consider all your cousins or the descendants of those people. So those are not the kinds of things that you're going to that you need to think through when you're starting out as a genealogist. I was in the situation of it's all been done category, and it took me only a very short time to discover that was not even vaguely the case with my own family. It's important when we begin the process of thinking about a goal or thinking about something that we're trying to achieve in a genealogical standpoint, is to understand that genealogy is a historical record and document-based process. It's important to just start to think that, because I'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation, but you really need to be aware that libraries and books and records and looking at old handwriting and trying to decipher names and things, that's all going to be part of the process of becoming and being involved in genealogy. And so it's something that's a very kind of particular interest. In other words, you really have to decide that you're going to do it, and you have to be able to stick to it long enough that you learn enough to make it possible for you to actually to do the work, to be able to understand it. We have a lot of young people coming in to the BYU Family History Library now. And it's very interesting because some of them, when they get started looking at records, realize that they do not know how to read cursive writing. And that for some people is a big barrier. And so throughout this presentation, the theme is going to be to have a goal and to be successful in genealogy. You need to be able to acquire the skills that are necessary in order for that to happen. And that's part of the process that we're talking about here. No one's born knowing how to do genealogical research. So all of us need to start learning at some point. I was trying to do my genealogy, my family history, and doing research into my family lines for quite a long time, number of years, like 10 or 15 years, before I ever realized that anybody else in the world was doing genealogy as such. I had literally no contact. This was long before the internet. So There wasn't any way to just automatically see that there was this community out there of genealogists. But I just never had that experience. It took me a long time to find out that there were books and that I could learn from the books about genealogy. And that's kind of how I got started. And then I found out that there were actually classes, you could take classes. And so I took classes actually from BYU, distance learning, which is independent study, and took classes for years on genealogy. So it was a process in my own mind. Now today, that process can be accelerated dramatically, because by going online and going on a program like Family Search or one of the other Ancestry or MyHeritage or whatever, you're immediately aware that there's this huge community of people out there doing genealogy. And if you are barraged by different emails, you'll find out that there are genealogical conferences happening all over the world, and it's possible to get together, and that libraries exist and all of this. Well, all of those things were things that I had to learn kind of from scratch, from doing, just actually trying to do the work. And as I mentioned, that research itself involves a number of skills. And I've mentioned reading old handwriting, basically how to find records in record repositories and libraries and archives, and how to find them online. And what we found to be a significant challenge to a significant number of people is that most of what we have today on computers involves technology. And it's a very high level of technology. In fact, today, one of the major things that's going on is that using artificial intelligence, which is in the news right now, there's all sorts of tasks in the genealogical community that can be done more quickly and more thoroughly, but including reading old handwriting recognition, and also indexing the records. Millions and millions of records are being indexed now using artificial intelligence indexing. And so some of the tasks that were being done by people in the past are now being done very quickly by the computer programs. And this is a good thing, because one of the major obstacles to learning about some families was that there were no records available from those particular areas. And if they were available, they weren't indexed, and you had to search through them page by page. And now this involvement in technology has moved us into the beginnings of that not being an issue or a problem in the future. So but understanding that technology and taking advantage of the technology is particularly having access to computers and the computer network and the things that are mentioned about the BYU library, for example. Over the last couple of years, because of the pandemic, we were forced to go online. And so now we have a significant amount of all the work we're doing in the library, like this webinar, for example, is being presented from my home in Provo, Utah. And so we are basically able to talk and teach and maintain contact with a greater genealogical community through this technology. But understanding that is now a part of What About the Library. But and as I mentioned, that achieving any goal, anything you want to really do that involves serious genealogy, and that doesn't mean just asking somebody to tell you about your family, and then that was it. But getting into actually learning about all of these people that you're related to, that requires a constant learning curve. There's just every day there is something new to learn. And this week for me has been no different than any other week. And that is, I've spent a period of time learning how to do things that I need to do in order to continue to be involved in genealogy at the level I am. We just waited just before, for example, before this webinar went on, to have the Zoom program updated. So everything is moving and everything is changing, and we need to be part of that learning process if we're going to be involved in genealogy. Watching a video like this video is a way to understand how all of this puts together and why you would want to be involved, and asking some pretty interesting questions about it as we go along. Now, the good thing about genealogy today, in today's world, is you can go to school and learn about genealogy. There's BYU has classes that are online that you can go through. There are many other, if you look for those online, there's whole studies online. The University, BYU Idaho, the university up in Idaho that's counterpart to BYU in Provo, has a family history department, online family history, substantial family history course studies. And I'm from my fact that one of my daughters teaches at those classes, I know that they're a challenge, and they are going to help you to understand some basic things that perhaps you have to learn that you didn't learn when you were in school. And so those are the kinds of things that'll help you move on. Or you can begin to educate yourself. There's so much available online. In fact, BYU Family History Library has over 850 videos online, and we're putting up a couple of 2 or 3 or 4 a week. And so the amount of information is just overwhelming. But if you begin and ask questions for instance, the simplest way to do it is to get onto Google or other search engine and start asking questions, because then you'll get answers of long lists of programs and things that you can become involved in. And also just put the word genealogy into youtube.com, and you'll find that there is a huge number, into the thousands of videos that talk about genealogy. And there's an important thing to understand. You don't need to be a professional genealogist, but you do need to learn about how to do the work. It's a process here. There's actually something that you need to learn. There are concepts, there are skills and things that are required. There's just no way you can do this without taking the time and becoming involved and being, in a sense, dedicated a little, whatever time you have or whatever you want to dedicate to the process of learning. It's always important to ask for help. I find people out there who have basically have a question. For example, I had someone I talked to in the library yesterday, and he had just gotten a new computer and was having difficulty with his computer. And I spent an hour, probably closer to 2 hours, talking him through how to learn the computer. So this is something that that's why we exist at the library. That's why we have our virtual help desk that you can contact and talk to us directly. That's why this all exists, is to help people. But if you don't ask for help and you don't seek it, and you get frustrated, or you start complaining about how difficult it is you need to have that feedback and the interchange between people who are already in the process of doing research and understand some of these challenges and difficulties that you might experience. Just to start out, fan charts and pedigree charts suggest automatic goals. Now, that's a good thing and a bad thing. The way it's a good thing is they give you an image of your family. You're showing your family in a very graphic way, but there's something very obvious going on here. There are gaps. So if we look at this fan chart, that a portion of a fan chart with one of my ancestors in the middle of this, then we'll see that her father was somebody named David Nathan Thomas. Actually, his middle name was not, he didn't have a middle name, but that's sort of been given to him. And he lived from 1820 to 1888. And we see that his father was also named David Thomas, and he lived from 1791 to 1836. But beyond that, we don't have anybody. And sometimes it seems very challenging or interesting, or it'd be like there's a distant mountain you want to climb, and a distant mountain here would be to find David Thomas's father, because that's the blank. But of course, if you look at the rest of it, there is always a blank. There is always somebody. And the important thing to understand about this, and this is kind of part of the learning process, is that because this is on the family search family tree, this is a part of that this is an open collaborative tree. And so the information from all of these people who are related to this family are essentially here on this family tree. And so this is where people have gotten after more than 100 years of genealogical research. So expecting and making that as a goal may be an ultimate goal in your life, but you're going to find that you're going to have to go back through and look through all of that 100 years of experience before you get to the father of David Thomas. So there are some things in about genealogy that seem automatically obvious that this is what you should be looking at. And the answer is that's not always the case, and it isn't always productive. But another thing that's important to understand about genealogy is you don't determine whether or not a genealogical goal is realistic. Now, let's kind of give an analogy here. We've got a mountain here in the background, and this is kind of a fantasy kind of picture. But we have this mountain in the background, and if I were healthy and young, a lot younger than I was, then I could make a goal to climb to the top of that mountain. That's probably at the time, unless I had some physical disabilities that I was unaware of or some problems, it would be a very realistic goal. And in fact, I spent a considerable amount of time doing that. I climbed lots of mountains. But genealogy is not like that. And the reason is that you can't determine whether when you make a genealogical goal that it is realistic. The only way you can do that is by starting to do it. And the difference between a realistic and unrealistic goal depends on the availability of historical records. And so when you start out, it may look like you have an actual goal out there, and it's like this soap bubble. It's in the picture that it's just a soap bubble. It is not real goal because of the fact that the records may not exist. So, for example, here, finding a specific ancestor who lived before 1700 may be a very unrealistic goal. And I meet a lot of people who are getting extremely frustrated trying to find their ancestor, and I say, well, when did the person live? And they say, well, he was born in 1760 or something like that. And I say, well, I understand now why you're having trouble, because you don't control whether or not that person's record even exists, and you may never have access to the record, even if it does exist. So that's the reality of dealing with historical records, and particularly historical records about a particular person. Now, when you speak of historical records for genealogy, there are billions and billions of records. But the problem is that as you go back in time, the number of those records that talk about individuals and identify individuals just diminishes rapidly. It's like a curve on a graph that just drops off close to nothing by 1700. So you have a very much more limited ability to identify a person every time you go back another generation. That decreases until finally you get back to the 1500s, and there are very, very few people, numerically speaking, compared to the total number of people in the world who have lived in that time, that could be found in the records that exist. And so your ability to make goals that go back that far are become limited. So here's a realistic goal, something that may be entirely possible. That is, to complete a 4-generation pedigree, where you have the names and the information on all of these people back 4 generations. Now, when we say 4 generations, we mean from you. So you're first generation, second generation, third generation, and then 4th generation. And you'll see when you get to back to the 4th generation, you're already back to the doubling the numbers in each generation. So you're already back to the time where you've 1 and then 2 and then 4 and then 8 people to deal with on that. And the continued on chart gives, this is the old paper way of extending your pedigree past the 4th into the 4th generation. Then you would have 8 different charts, more pedigree charts out there. So it's a lot easier to do this on the internet with one of the major programs, because this whole form and thing is automatically generated, and you don't have to keep copying numbers out, getting more and more paper as you go back. So here's another one. A goal to find a specific record for an individual may be unrealistic. Now, what I mean by that is someone will come to me and say, well, I've been looking for a long time for a death certificate for my ancestor. And I say, well, okay, ancestor, where was ancestor born? Ancestor was born in Arizona. Okay. And when was, and where did he live in Arizona? Well, he lived in Gila County, Arizona. Okay. So you can't find a birth record for him? No, I can't find anything about his birth. Well, let's look on the research wiki on family search. Very quickly, knowing this kind of information, basically from the learning process, you can go out to this resource called the Research Wiki, which is on familysearch.org under the search tab. And you can look in Arizona, genealogy in Arizona, and you can look at vital records, which are birth, death, and marriage records. And then you can go there, and when you click on a county, like Gila County, it will tell you exactly when the first birth records were made. And I can tell you, just as a rule, I don't know the exact date, but it was in the 1880s and 1890s before anybody started keeping birth records on the state level or any level systematically. And so if they were born earlier than that, the chances are you have to go to a family record like a Bible record, or you'd have to go to a newspaper record, or you'd have to go to some other record. And this is part of the process that we're talking about. And that goes into rule 2 of genealogy, which says the absence of an obituary or death record does not mean the person is still alive. And I might say that the absence of a birth record does not mean that the person was never born. There's just, it just seems pretty obvious, but if you understand what that means, it means that there are some records that are missing and they will never be found. And to make a goal to find that record and to spend an inordinately large time on that one goal is not going to get you very far in genealogy. So you learn how to, as the analogy goes, plow around the rocks in the field. In other words, the records that can't be found immediately or after a reasonable or even exhaustive search are probably records that you're going to have to generate in some other way. And that's part of the process of learning how to do genealogy, is learning that, oh, I can't find that a birth record in the parish registers or in the church records. So where else would they be found? And there may be an answer to that, and there may not be. And that's part of the process also. So here we have something that creates unreasonable expectations in the sense of making goals. And genealogists have a long tradition of bragging about the number of people they found or how far back they've gone. And I would probably be independently wealthy if I could get some kind of a payment for every time somebody had asked me, well, how far back have you found your ancestors? And the answer now I give is far enough. That's about it. And they'll say, well, how many people have you found? And I said, well, my people are in the family tree, and I think there's 1.5 billion that I could probably look at right now. So both of those things are correct, but the questions are meaningless. And if we look closely at this, by the way, I didn't make this up. This, if you look closely at this slide, you'll see that this is a slide on the family search family tree for Adam, who was born in 4004 BC, and he lived until 3070 BC. And he has a couple of research problems, and let's look at some of the research problems he has. His birth is after the birth of his son is after his death. Okay, so that interesting, because Seth was born in 231 BC, which means he was just 200 years before, and he lived until 1143 AD on a way looking at this. So it's kind of an interesting thing that information's there in the family search family tree. I don't know where. I mean, I'd like to know where the person got that. Of course, the standardized birthplace of Garden of Eden, and the death place of Canaan, East Eden, and where he was buried in the cave of Machpelah in Hebron. All of that is interesting, but there are no sources for this at all, other than the Bible and speculation and some other records. But if you get wrapped up in this, by the way, and you start making this as your goal to go back and get into this, I'm going to say, genealogically imaginary world, is that's when you start to have some real problems, because you're not really accomplishing anything. You're not going anyplace. There are no actual documents for you to examine. There's nothing back at the beginning when I started with the statement about the genealogy is based on historical records. Well, you have to have historical records, and until you have a parent-child relationship supported by a historical record, you're not moving back in time, and that stops. Like I said earlier, usually around the 1500s, or more recent than that, into the 1700s, is where suddenly there's just no records that show you who these people are. So here's what I would ask you to consider. How about measuring success by the accuracy and sources you find for each entry in your family tree? Let's say documenting a person and actually having records which show how they lived, where they lived, who they were, and what they accomplished in their lives. That's where I feel like we have a success. And and you begin to, because you're actually related to your people, if that's the case, then you'll start to feel this connection and this ability to understand the problems and things and challenges that they faced. And that's where the real core of genealogy is, because that's where you're really got to look at that. So here's some questions that I have put out here in this presentation to help you, whether you want to even have a genealogical goal. These are the kinds of questions that you should answer for yourself to find out if you are interested enough and motivated enough to become involved in genealogy. And the first one of these is pretty simple, is how much time are you willing to spend doing genealogical research? If you're limiting the time that you spend to a very short time every week, every month, or once a year, I can assure you that you'll never get past the very, very, very beginning stage of understanding genealogy and genealogical research, because it takes a significant time commitment. And that may be the biggest barrier to people getting involved in genealogy. And if you happen to know somebody who's involved, you probably think, well, I'm never going to do that, because that's all they ever do is look for records, and they're obsessed with it. And so basically, well, that issue is made about genealogy, that people become obsessed with it. And at the same time, the person who's saying that may spend 40, 50, 60 hours a week at their job, or doing something else that they're involved in. So it's a choice of time. So the next question is, how much effort are you willing to give to learn what you need to know? So I'm giving an example here of a record back in the 1800s. And I basically sat down with people many, many times with a similar type of record, and they basically say, I can't even understand a thing about that. I can't read anything on that. Well, that's probably not true. But part of the process is learning how to look at this and being able to read it. Not just decipher it letter by letter, but actually sit here and read it like you would read a book or any other document. And so this is a printed document. So this is, and I can assure you that after the time period that you spend and effort that you spend on this, that all of a sudden you'll understand and realize that you too can read this stuff. It just gets to the point where you can learn it. It's a learned skill. But you need to answer that question. Are you willing to take the effort, make the effort to learn it? And then the obvious, how many other activities are you willing to give up? Are you willing to give up your golf game? Are you willing to quit going to NRA races? Are you going to, or the stock car races or whatever? Are you going to, which part of your life are you going to adjust so that you can do and be involved in genealogical research? And that's something that all of us have to answer. We all have to go through that process, that thought process, and whether you're spending your time at the library and being involved, or if you're very much involved online doing research, you have to make that as a personal choice. And at the same time, you have to understand that you're going to be giving up other outside activities, sports, and other things that you might have been heavily involved in. And that's one of the things. It's something that you have to spend time with, and it takes time to learn. And here's the ultimate question, and this is one that I think probably stops a considerable number of people, and that, do you like sitting in libraries and working on computers? Because you're going to spend an awful lot of time sitting in libraries and working on computers, and or sitting at home working on a computer. Because that's where not all, but that's where basically the information for starting to do genealogy is located. And as you get more and more into it, you'll find out that you'll probably need to travel. You'll probably need to go someplace. You'll probably think, well, if I could just go down to southern Utah, I could look in the cemetery where I know they're buried, and that would tell me who's buried there. Well, you may find that there's a program online that already tells you who's buried in that cemetery. But eventually you're going to find out that there's records that you do not have available online, and that if you want to see those records or visit those, you're going to have to visit those places. And so there's inevitably in genealogy, there's some travel ending up being involved in being and looking at and being involved in it, including a lot of cemeteries, by the way. So let's look at some of the kinds of questions that could be a genealogical goal and decide if this particular situation is something. Now, I mentioned David Thomas earlier, and my great-grandfather David Nathan Thomas. And I could basically look at this and we see some things about it. This person was born in David Thomas was married in 1818 to Sarah Morris, and this is the certificate that we found for his marriage. And we have the date, we have the place, and we know that it's on the 3rd of March in 1818. And we also now know the place. So we can begin to look for this person, David Thomas. And if you would probably, if you began this process, you'd very quickly get into the question, and that is, who were David Thomas's parents? So we know that he was married in this parish, and we know that we can guess about how old he might have been. It says he's a yeoman, which means he's a free landowner. So he must be somebody we could find. And then what we find is that he was buried. And we find a David Thomas that was buried in 1836. And this is the place where he was buried, in Carmarthenshire, Wales. And here's the book that shows it. So we've been starting to do our genealogy. We have discovered these records. These records are available online, and we've been able to find that where it is. And we're with a person that has a burial date, and he has a calculated birth date and a marriage date. And we have a place. We have an exact place where this person lived and died. But then we get into the parish register, and it turns out in that exact place, there are over 100 people with that name. And they're on all sorts of burial dates and places. And there's no correlation between the baptisms and the burials. So how do we know which one of these is the person? Well, I'm going to answer that question real quick. We don't, and 100 years of research hasn't cracked it. So, it's not something that, without additional records that we presently do not have, that we're going to be able to tell which of all these David Thomases is the one who was the father, who's my direct line ancestor. So it may be an interesting or a challenging goal, but it's not achievable. It's unrealistic, because just the nature of what's going on here. So let's try another goal. Let's look and see what else we could probably find. Okay, so we're going to look at this. And the important thing is to choose a goal that's matched to your skill level, your degree of commitment, and the time you're willing to devote, and whether it's achievable. Okay, so how do we know about that? Well, there's ways to do that. We're going to look at this list of descendants. It's called descendants. They're descendants of a person named William Hines Godfrey, who was born in 1800. These are his descendants that are in the family search family tree right now. And so there are 3 opportunities that present themselves here. And I'm going to qualify these by saying they are achievable and realistic goals, and they are relatively straightforward in that, and for some reasons that I'll point out. There are 3 different goals, and here's they are. First of all, we have Susan Lily Norton, and she's born in 1859, and it says she's deceased. Well, considering all the people who have contributed to the family search family tree, and considering the time frame of how long they've been accumulating these records, you would think that somebody would have found Susan in 1859 and know when she died. And so this is an opportunity, because why? It's because we're in England, And because we're in England, we have an 1851 census, an 1841 and 51 census, and a 61 and a 71 and an 81 and a 91 and a 2001 and a 91 and a so forth. We have all this every 10-year census records. And we can probably find this family and be very careful. And census records in England always tell where the person was born. And so we can begin to follow that person's life through the census records and accumulate more information about the person. And we may find a marriage record, and then we may find a whole family. And so we've actually used this to kind of bootstrap ourselves up and use the information that's here to find additional information that will take us past the what appears to be an end of that person's life, a brick wall in a sense. But there is no death date. So we know that there was a birth date. We know this person lived, and we look to see they have records, and we determine that there are records and that they turn up in the census. And then we find out, and as we do more research, we will begin to find out exactly where this person lived, and then we can look and see if a person with that name got married in that very close small area, and then more records will appear, and eventually you'll find this person with all of their descendants, beginning in 1859. Second one is a person who lived a very long time, and the way this works is that this person got married, but basically they looked here and found that there's people that lived that long time, that, and like above there's another one that says living. Of course, if they're in this family and they're in that 1800s, they wouldn't be living, and they don't show a marriage and have a long, but even though they have a long life. So that's another possibility. But this person is having a marriage, but supposing they did not. And then the third one, and I just wanted to have ones that were right close to each other, is one where they have no or few children. So these are the three categories. Now, if it turns out they already have a wife, then they wouldn't be able to see. So you have John William Godfrey, who was married to Maria Louise Sewell, and then you have two children. Well, a child in 1876 and 1878, there's always the possibility that there were more children. And because there are census records, it's going to be fairly straightforward to find out if this particular family had children. So the whole process here of learning about genealogy is to keep working and keep learning, because as you go through the process, you will find more and more opportunities. And if you measure your success by what you're able to accomplish in finding additional people for your family tree, in that sense, you can always feel a measure of success, because there's help there. And if you're not finding additional people because your ancestors lived in a really different location, or there was other circumstances, then there's always their descendants of the ones you've able to find, to look for. So there's a lot of things to do. Now, another way, let's say you're saying, okay, now I can't do anything because I was found on the steps of the hospital or on the steps of a fire station, and I'm what's known as a foundling, and I have no idea who my family is. Well, we have a marvelous new technology called DNA testing. And through DNA testing and putting it in the larger websites that have huge family trees, it's very possible, and it's happening every day, and there's news about it consistently, of people who are finding their family for the first time through DNA and starting this process that gets them into the process of finding the rest of their ancestors. So what is success? What do we actually, what do we determine that we've been successful in doing genealogy? And it's achieving or completing a goal. And as long as your goal is realistic and it's something that you will feel happy about or satisfied about achieving, it's achievable goal. It's going to be a good goal. But unfortunately, we're all obsessed by numbers, and that goes with the how many people do you have in your family tree question. And so the answer is, it's not based on any concept of numbers. Genealogy has nothing to do with numbers. It has to do with the effort and the success of finding and understanding and learning about the people. And if you can't go past a few number of people, then spend as much time as you can possibly want on those people that you know, on learning about them and documenting their lives. Okay, so when you achieve your own personal goal is when you have success. And it has to be an internal thing. There aren't any cash prizes, there aren't any awards, there's no, and generally speaking, even if there is some sort of recognition, it's not widely enough known that your neighbors would even know about it. So you'd really have to live to be successful internally and feel that you're achieving those things that you feel are important. And that's what's important about genealogy, because it actually gives you a measurable understanding and connection with your ancestors that helps you to understand who you are and understand how you got to where you are now today. So that's it. Thanks for watching.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you will join us for our next webinar, which is on June 8th with Byron Holdeman. He will be giving a presentation entitled The Library of Congress, a Treasure for Genealogy. A recording of this webinar will be made available next week. You can view that on our YouTube channel or on our website. Thank you and have a wonderful week.